00081. Another mystic member? Agatha portaled into the base and took a moment to look around at the runic spell that was carved into the room. Then she looked down at Ebony as she asked, "You sure know how to get into trouble, don't you?" Meow. Agatha chuckled and her voice had a hint of sarcasm as she said, "I'm sure it was just luck." Agatha walked forward out of the portal room with Ebony at her side and stopped when she saw a silver-haired man leaning against the wall reading a little orange book. Ebony moved in front of her and hissed at the man who glanced up at them. He let out a sigh and put his book away as he said, "Just when I was getting to the good part." The man turned and started walking down the hallway as he said, "Follow along. We don't want you to get lost." Ebony hissed again, then meowed a few times. Agatha nodded her head as she moved to follow the thing that looked like a man and said, "That girl knows better. I'm sure she has an explanation for what is going on." Agatha studied the thing in front of her as she walked. It had no soul, with only a faint hint of life force. The thing would most likely die sometime tomorrow if it was lucky. What was most puzzling is she couldn't sense anything demonic from it. Normally, a creature like this would have demonic energy leaking from it with noticeable mutations on its body. It should be in the end stages of its host's life, and it should be searching for a new host to take over right now. It wasn't long before they arrived in front of a door, which the creature pointed at and said, "This is your stop." She watched as the creature leaned against the wall, pulled out its book, and started reading again. When she didn't move for a few moments, the man continued reading while he said, "What's wrong? Did you get lost on the path of life or something?" The man waved his free hand in a shooing motion as he said, "Go on now. It's impolite to keep people waiting." She looked down at Ebony for a second before she moved to open the door. As she did, Ebony moved behind her and watched her back as she entered the room. Inside of the room, a group of people were seated along with another soulless creature. Surprisingly, she recognized two people, the ancient one being the main person and Steve Rogers, a war hero who everyone thought was dead. As she glanced at everyone in the room, they also studied her. Agatha Harkness wore a tight, body-hugging, knee-length purple dress, with a dark purple shawl draped over her shoulders. She stood almost 6 feet tall with a voluptuous body that was highlighted by her alluring face and piercing blue eyes. She had a single streak of ghost white hair running down the right side of her otherwise thick raven black hair that framed her face and flowed down to the middle of her back. After she took in everyone in the room, Agatha's gaze stopped on Tao and she said, "You have a lot of explaining to do, young lady." Ezekiel smirked and elbowed Tao, who was seated next to him, as he said, "She just called you a young lady. Can't she see you've gone bald with old age?" Everyone tried to hold in a smile, except for Tao and Agatha. Tao shot a quick glare at Ezekiel as Agatha also looked at him before she said, "Be quiet, you soulless demon. I didn't come here to talk with you." Ezekiel grabbed his heart as he said, "Oh, it hurts. You just had to target my insecurities. Do you have any idea how much this'll cost in therapy?" Before Agatha could speak, Tao slapped Ezekiel so hard he turned into a puff of smoke. Agatha turned a questioning gaze to Tao, who shrugged as she said, "Sorry. Sometimes he is a little too much." Fury rolled his one eye as he said, "More like most of the time," while Peggy and a few others nodded in agreement. Agatha started to speak, but was cut off as the door opened, and in walked the silver-haired man who said, "Now that was just rude. It's a good thing I had Tobarama work on improving the formula, so everyone now gets the memory packets." Tao glared at Ezekiel as she said, "Try to be serious this time." Agatha watched as the creature walked past her and turned back into the other creature that just disappeared. She was surprised when it happened since its life force became weaker afterwards. Ezekiel sat back down as he said, "Fine, Mom." Tao raised her hand slightly as she said, "Test me." Ezekiel lowered his head as he said, "Sorry, Master. Please don't spank me. I'll be a good boy, I swear." Tao smacked Ezekiel again, and he disappeared into another cloud of smoke. Then she looked at Agatha as she said, "Please take a seat and don't mind the idiot." Agatha glanced around the room and noticed almost everyone was trying to hold back another smile. She moved forward and took the empty seat at the table across from Tao. After she sat down and Ebony had moved behind her chair, Agatha looked at Tao as she asked, "What exactly is going on here and what was that thing?" Ezekiel answered as he walked through the door and said, "It's impolite to call somebody a thing. Ezekiel walked around the table and moved his chair away from Tao this time. He shot a quick glare at her as he sat back down, which she returned with a smug smile. He grumbled, "Rude," under his breath before he looked at Agatha as he said, "As for what I am, you can think of me as a projection from my real body that has a physical form. That doesn't make sense. Your solid and life force energy is slowly leaking out of your body. With those factors and your lack of a soul, you show all the classic signs of a demonic possession." Tao nodded as she said, "I thought the same thing when I first met him, but it's one of his innate abilities. Try looking at him through an advanced viewing spell for seeing spirits." Agatha weaved her hands together as she chanted a spell. When she finished, she looked at Ezekiel for about a minute before she said, "Fascinating. Is it a new magical spell? Possibly a magical construct? I would love to meet your creator and talk with them." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Unfortunately, Tao is the only person who has met the real me, and I don't plan to change that anytime soon." "Who's Tao?" Ezekiel pointed at Tao as he said, "Calling her the Ancient One is a mouthful, and since she won't tell me her real name, I shortened it to Tao." Agatha smiled the tiniest bit as she said, "I happen to know her name." Tao frowned as she said, "You wouldn't. For the right price I would. It's just your name after all, dear. Nothing really important." Fury cleared his throat before he said, "As interesting as all of this is, some of us have more important things to do. So can we get to the main reason we are here, and then you can go back to discussing stuff that doesn't really matter." Agatha glanced at Fury as she said, "All right, child. Why did you invite me here?" Fury had a vein pop on his forehead as he asked, "What part of me looks like a child?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "She called Tao young lady, and she is closing in on being 1,000 years old. I think almost everyone in the world is considered a child in her eyes." Agatha nodded as she said, "While it's impolite to ask a woman her age, just know I was alive well before Atlantis fell below the ocean. Now, why was I called here? I know it wasn't because of Ebony's little stunt early." Everyone glanced at Tao and waited for her to speak. Tao smiled a little as she said, "You're right. I asked you here so we could invite you to join us." Agatha took another quick glance at everyone in the room before she asked, "And what exactly would I be joining?" "A secret group that is plotting to change the current world order." Agatha turned to look at Ezekiel, while Fury let out a groan of annoyance. Peggy spoke up next as she said, "While Ezekiel is correct, he could word it better. Our main goal is working to make the world a better place for everyone. That means humans and metahumans." Agatha nodded before she said, "With someone like Captain America here, I assumed as much. But what about people who practice the mystic arts? Witches, warlocks, shamans, witch doctors, and others? Would you make the world better for them too?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Sure, if they act like decent human beings and don't do stuff like kill virgins, bathe in the blood of babies, or summon demons. You know, classic dumb shit that only losers would do because their parents didn't love them enough." Ezekiel smirked a little as everyone went quiet except Agatha, who started to laugh. When she stopped, she looked at Tao as she said, "I like him. He reminds me of a young Yao. Is the real one like these constructs?" Tao nodded, which made Agatha smile as she said, "Great. I'll join your little group on the condition that I can meet him." Fury raised his eyebrow as he asked, "Really? You don't need to know anything else?" Agatha shook her head as she said, "Not really, since the young one here is working with you. Even though I am surprised she is. Last time we talked, her main concern was keeping the timeline in check." Everyone looked at Ezekiel, who smirked and waved as he said, "It was my fault. She can't really see the future with me in the world." Ezekiel then shook his head and said, "Anyways, it's not my call on meeting the real me. Give me a few minutes to let the boss know what you want." Ezekiel turned into a puff of smoke, and Fury stood up as he said, "I have other stuff to do. Let me know if she joins and I will factor her into future plans." Everyone else started to leave the room with different reasons until only Agatha and Tao were left. Agatha gave a little smile as she asked, "So how long has this been going on for?" "About 2 years now. I'm a little surprised you didn't reach out to me before this." Tao gave a little shrug as she said, "We've been busy and I didn't think you would be that interested." "You've changed." Tao frowned the tiniest bit, which made Agatha smile as she said, "That right there is what I am talking about. Don't worry, showing emotion is good for you." I always thought you were too stiff and needed to loosen up since you took over from Yao. What happened to the young, excitable girl I met who just enjoyed learning magic? Tao frowned a little more as she said, I grew up. Agatha laughed before she said, bullshit. You just used that stupid eye too much. You know you don't have to pick the optimal path, right? Yao didn't. Why do you think he gave up the spot to you? It was because he got tired of it, and you were the best replacement he could find. That's not true. Agatha shook her head as she said, when he comes back again, you should talk with him about it. You will find that Yao is a lot more flexible than you realize. Before Tao could speak again, the door opened and another Ezekiel walked in. He paused as he saw the tense atmosphere and asked, did I interrupt something? Both women shook their heads before Agatha asked, so do I get to meet the real you? Ezekiel nodded as he said, the boss agreed since it's you, but he has 2 requests. What are they? Ezekiel smirked as he looked at Tao and said, first you will need to tell him Tao's real name when you met. You'll also have to swear on your magic to not tell anyone who he really is, where he lives, or anything about his family. That's a little strict, isn't it? Ezekiel shrugged as he said, he's paranoid and wants to protect his family. Tao swore on her magic before she met him. Well, I can't be outdone by a youngster, now can I? 00082. Is something wrong with your head? Agatha looked around the massive room Tao had portaled them into. She had to admit it was impressive, but also a little bit confusing. She understood the area where she stood with Tao. Most mystic practitioners would be in heaven in this place. But the large, almost barren area in the middle was a little weird. Maybe it was used to practice spells? But that didn't explain the massive rock wall or pool of water below it. The area on the other side of the room was what really confused her, though. She saw a bunch of different weight equipment along with massive data storage towers. The kind you would normally see in a data center, but here they were just lined up against the far wall. Above the server towers along the wall were 3 giant TVs that she didn't even know existed. She could easily see what was displayed on their screens from here. One showed a staircase, one a hallway area, and the last one a bedroom, all of which were currently empty of people. Maybe they were made with magic? She couldn't feel any magic from them, but that was the only thing that made sense to her. As she looked around, Agatha asked, so what exactly is this place? Tao grimaced as she said, Ezekiel called it his training room. Agatha nodded as she said, I admit it's rare to find a mystic practitioner who cares so much about body training. It's a shame more practitioners of the arts don't put in the effort to hone their body. Tao nodded in agreement before she said, we're in agreement on that. It's why I force everyone in Kamartaj to practice martial arts. Tao smirked a little as she said, also you're wrong about Ezekiel. He is not yet a sorcerer or even a practitioner of the mystic arts. Then why is all of this here, and how did he make those constructs without the mystic arts? It's not some type of inborn power, right? They look to be made with a complex spell matrix. Tao motioned to everything around her as she said, I am going to start training him in the mystic arts, so I brought everything we will need. As for his constructs, he calls them shadow clones, and they are kind of like an inborn power for him. It's a little complicated to explain properly, honestly. Agatha glanced at Tao as she asked, you are taking him as a personal student? I thought you were saving that for your replacement? Tao nodded as she said, I was. But once you meet him, you will understand why. Actually, where is he at? I thought he was going to meet us here. Tao smiled a little as she said, at this time he is probably reading a bedtime story to his little sister. I would give it about half an hour before he makes it down here. Then while we wait, we can get back to our earlier conversation. Before they could really get into a deep conversation, Theo appeared from the portal into the room. He quickly used body flicker and appeared next to Tao and Agatha, bouncing up and down on his feet as he asked, so what's Tao's real name? Agatha smiled as Tao frowned before Agatha asked, wishing to know a lady's secrets and not having the decency of a proper introduction first? What are you, a savage? Theo paused for a second before he said, sorry, I was excited and forgot my manners. Theo gave a polite bow before he said, my name is Theodore Ezekiel Mercer, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Mississippi Harkness. Agatha nodded her head as she said, the pleasure is mine, but I must ask, why do you look like a child? Theo smirked as he asked, because I am? Agatha studied Theo for a while and even used a few spells before she looked at Tao and asked, "You aren't playing a joke on me, are you?" Theo laughed and Tao smiled before Theo said, "This isn't a joke. I'm reincarnated and currently living my second life." Agatha glanced between Tao and Theo for a few moments and then asked, "How is that even possible?" Theo shrugged as he said, "Having really good karma lets you meet God, and he uses your karma to help in your reincarnation. I would love to hear about everything you remember from your experience." Theo pointed at Tao as he said, "Just ask her about it. She's seen it, and we've discussed it at length a few times already." Agatha pouted a little as she asked, "Secondhand info just isn't the same." Theo shrugged again as he said, "Well, I really don't want to explain it again and answer a bunch of questions I already answered for Tao." Theo paused for a moment before he said, "I could just show you, but you would have to lower your defenses." Ebony meowed a few times, sitting next to Agatha's feet. Agatha smiled and looked down at Ebony as she said, "It'll be fine, Ebony. Saskia trusts him." Tao let out a sigh as Theo stopped and stared at her for a while. Before he confusedly asked, "That's Celtic?" "No, it's Old High German." Theo glanced at Agatha as he asked, "I thought she was Celtic?" "She is." Theo frowned as he asked, "But I thought Celtic people were from Ireland or something?" Tao let out a sigh and Agatha shook her head before she said, "The Celtic culture originated from." "You know, it doesn't really matter. Her real name is Saskia. Now give me a moment and I will take down my defenses." Agatha sat down in one of the chairs Tao had brought over from one of the sanctums. She started to weave her hands a few times as she chanted. After about a minute, she looked at Theo as she said, "All right, you can show me. Actually, one question before we start. It's been bugging me. How did Ebony find our base?" "It should have been protected." Agatha glanced down at Ebony as she said, "Ebony has the ability to slip into places she isn't allowed. She can also sense portal fluctuations and piggyback off them. With those skills, it's easy for her to go to most places people don't want her to visit." Theo glanced at Tao as he asked, "Is that something we can fix for the future?" Agatha responded instead as she said, "Yes, I can help though, since I already know how to hide and block the skills." Theo nodded before he went through a few hand signs and smirked as he said, "All right, now open your mind." Agatha's eyes glazed over as Theo turned to look at Tao, the smirk still on his face, and said, "So what do you want to start with, Saskia?" Tao shook her head as she said, "I would prefer it if you didn't use that name." "That's fine. I like the name I gave you better anyways. But it's also nice to finally know your real name." Tao shook her head and said, "While you learn from me, you will call me Master." Theo nodded his head as he said, "Yes, Master. But before we start, should we make a safe word or something? That's how this stuff normally works, right?" Tao gave Theo a flat look before she pointed at a bookshelf and said, "That is everything a beginner needs to learn before they can attempt to start casting spells. I want you to memorize all of those books, and then we can start your training." Theo let out a sigh and then weaved seals to produce 10 clones. Each one grumbled about not being the lucky one who was sleeping in Theo's bed as they grabbed a book and sat down on the floor to start reading. Theo glanced at Agatha as he said, "She should be out in about an hour. I'm gonna start my body training for now." Tao nodded as she pulled out a book from a different shelf to read. Theo himself went over to the rock wall and began to climb up it using his chakra control technique he had been improving with his blocks. He increased the difficulty by making sure he had a perfect connection before he moved, and then he would pull himself up to the next hand hold and repeat. He only made it about 20 feet up before his grip faltered, and he fell into the water pit below him. He popped out of the water and then swam over to the side of the pool before he pulled himself out. Another feature Tao made for the pool of water was it wouldn't leave the area, so when Theo climbed out, he was completely dry. After taking a quick break, he started over again and made it about 20 feet again before his arm gave out and he couldn't pull himself up. He dropped off the wall into the water again, before he took another break on the edge of the pool. He repeated the process a few more times until Agatha came out of the Genjutsu. Theo moved over to join Agatha, and Tao once he fell off the wall again. Agatha was in the middle of discussing what she saw with Tao when Theo arrived. Agatha looked at Theo as she asked, "That really happened? Are you sure that wasn't some kind of dream you had?" Theo shrugged as he said, "Honestly, no clue. But I am where I asked to be and I have the powers I asked for, so I don't think so. Also, I shouldn't have to ask this, but please keep what you saw to yourself." You and Tao are the only people who know the whole truth. Everyone else just knows I'm reincarnated. Agatha nodded as she said, I can do that, but I have to ask, why do you trust me so much? Theo smirked as he said, because you and Tao are some of the most powerful people in the world, and I knew you wouldn't freak out knowing about something like this. Plus, Tao keeps wanting to talk about it at length, so now you can talk with her about it instead of me. Agatha narrowed her eyes a little as she said, That's not the only reason, is it? Theo shook his head as he said, Nope, that's about it. Agatha kept looking at Theo for over a minute before he finally said, All right, fine. I always liked both of you as characters when you came up in the comics and really wanted to meet you. Happy? Agatha nodded as she said, See, that wasn't so hard. Theo blushed a little bit as he looked away, making Tao and Agatha both laugh at his actions. Agatha then stood up as she said, I'll be back in a while. I need to go collect some things. Theo was about to ask why, when Agatha said, I can't have little Saskia here teach you about the mystic arts and not help. While I know she will train you well, I will help out and plan to teach you about the more esoteric things. I will also teach you about the alchemy side of things, which is something you can't learn in Kamartaj. Theo glanced at Tao, who nodded as she said, I assumed she would help out. Theo smiled as he said, Well then let me give you a proper introduction to the place since I know Tao didn't. Tao preemptively winced as Theo raised his arms and gestured to the room as he said, This is the springtime of youth, super secret DBZ-inspired enhanced gravity training room of the mystic arts, body training, programming, and ninjutsu practice. Theo smirked as he asked, What do you think? Agatha was wide-eyed as she stared at Theo for over a minute before she asked, He's an idiot, right? Tao nodded her head and Ebony gave out a low meow as Theo let out a huff as he said, At least Minato and Guy like the name. 00083. Side story 003. Kids being kids. Ava looked around at her friends sitting with her at lunch as she said, It'll work. Me and Sky went for an hour last night and no one noticed us being gone. Natasha cautiously glanced around the cafeteria for a moment before she asked in a low voice, But don't we have to pay for stuff? We have no money. Yelena glanced at her sister as she said, We could just pickpocket a few people when we get there. Sky shook her head and held up a bracelet as she said, This is a VIP bracelet. If you have one, they don't charge you anything and you can skip the lines. Ava found where they were kept and took some for us to use along with entry tickets. I'm not sure it's a good idea. What if we get caught? Maybe we should just ask Ezekiel to let us go. I am pretty sure he would say yes. Laura nodded as she said, Cecily is right. We should ask Ezekiel first. Hope shook her head as she said, I don't think we should. If he says no, we won't be able to sneak out afterwards. Cap likes to say, It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Natasha smiled at her sister as she said, He is talking about when you are doing the right thing. I am pretty sure this isn't what he was talking about. Feels right to me. Yelena smiled back as she winked. Cecily frowned as she asked, Fine, we'll do it. But what about me? I'll attract a lot of attention with how I look. Laura patted her arm as she said, You'll be fine, and if anyone makes a big deal, I'll beat the shit out of them. Natasha smiled as she said, If you do, that will definitely attract attention. What you can do is wear a long sleeve shirt, some gloves and pants. Then if we find you a wig, glasses, and a hat to wear, almost no one will be able to see what you look like. Cecily thought about it for a few moments before she asked, My normal hair wouldn't work? Natasha shook her head as she said, It looks like it's dyed and would draw more attention to you. The key to blending in is to look as average as possible. If we dress you up and keep you near the middle of the group, no one will notice. Where will we get a wig from? Yelena almost jumped out of her seat as she excitedly said, In one of the store rooms. I found a case full of them when I was looking around for some throwing knives. Settle down. We want to keep this a secret, remember? Also, what kind of storage room has throwing knives and wigs? Eric asked as he looked over at Yelena. Yelena looked a little embarrassed and settled back into her seat as she said, It's from the red room. My mother wanted to save most of the training supplies. Natasha nodded as she said, So with that we should be fine. But are you sure people won't notice us missing from the base? What if someone comes looking for us and we aren't here? Ava glanced around the room at the other kids eating as she said, Maybe we can have some kids cover for us while we are gone? That could work, but then the other girls would want to join us next time. Sky nodded as she said, We could do it in groups. The first group is us. Next group would be whoever we get to cover for us. Natasha frowned slightly as she said, I'm pretty sure all the girls will find out. That will be a lot of people to take. Ava shrugged as she said, It'll be fine. It will just take a while for everyone to go. Maybe 3 or 4 trips. So what's the plan? When are we going to do this? Grant said as he smiled at his younger brother, who practically bounced in his seat from excitement. Ava glanced around the table at all of her friends as she said, Saturday after lunch, since we will have the rest of the day free, and no one will notice if we miss dinner. All of them nodded in agreement, and then started to prepare over the next few days anything they might need. Over the next few days, Natasha was right, and all of the girls from the Red Room found out about the plan. All of them agreed to cover for the people in the first group, which expanded into almost 40 people. The plan was to take 3 separate groups over the next 3 weeks. The girls decided who would go in each group by who was doing the best on the wall test. While the 2 girls who were currently in the lead for courting Grant and Eric were allowed to join the first group so they could hang out with their crush. On Saturday, as lunch was ending, people started to pair off, and everyone made last-minute checks before they would meet Ava, who was phased inside the portal room. She would quickly portal groups of 3 to 5 out of the base, and after half an hour, everyone in the first group was gone. Ava arrived through a portal with the last group, which included Sky, Cecily, Laura, Natasha, Yelena, and Hope. The place that they portaled into was a spot a few blocks away from their destination that currently wasn't in use. Sky handed out the wristbands and tickets to everyone. Then the group of 40 kids and teenagers moved out in small groups every few minutes. Ava's group was the last one, but as they walked up to the entrance, all of them were excited. The sign above the entrance said, Welcome to the most magical place on Earth. Ava looked at her friends, and they all shared a smile before they moved to the entrance of the park. It didn't take them long at all to get inside and explore the place. Before they knew it, almost 6 hours had passed by, and all the groups met back up where they started. Ava then slowly portaled everyone back to the base, and everyone hid what they brought back inside of their rooms. After a few days passed and no one got in trouble, Ava planned out the next trip for the next group. The following Saturday, another group of 40 kids snuck out of the base with Ava's help and spent time at the theme park. When nothing happened that following week, Ava helped the last group sneak out to the park. Once that first round of trips was over, Ava and the others started to plan another trip to another park. It took them a couple weeks to find a park, scope it out, and then find ways they could get free stuff. But once they were all set, the first group of 40 went on a Saturday afternoon, while Ava and her friends were running around exploring the new theme park. Someone who was a user of Theo's social media platform managed to capture a few images of Cecily and her friends and uploaded them to the platform. One of Theo's clones was alerted from his built-in monitoring app and did a double take. Then he checked the base's cameras and saw when all of the kids snuck out of the base earlier in the day. He then went back and saw that they had done it before, and it wasn't just one group. Every single kid in the base had snuck out at least once in the past 2 months or so, since Ava learned to make portals. As he was going through the footage, he even saw Ava sneak out of the base a few times with only a handful of people with her. Ezekiel let out a long sigh and dropped his head on his desk. He knew Fury and probably a few other people were going to be pissed at this oversight. Shursui, who was seated close by reading a book, looked over at the computer screen for a few moments before he burst out laughing, which made Ezekiel let out a groan of frustration. Shursui shook his head as he said, I told you something like this might happen. Fury's been nagging me about base security, and why don't we have an operations room? Or a monitoring station with a 24-hour crew rotation? Now he'll force the issue, and I can't even say no because of this. Ezekiel banged his head against the desk in frustration as he finished. Shursui stood up as he placed his book down. Then he walked over and patted Ezekiel's shoulder as he said, You can sulk later. We have some work to do. Ezekiel glanced up as he said, You do it. I don't want to deal with this. Shursui smirked as he said, No can do. You're the one who acts for the boss man. It took over a minute for Ezekiel to sit up and start typing on his computer. After a few moments, boxes started to open up from different people. He glanced at them all for a moment before he said, We have an issue that needs attention. Please join me in the meeting room in half an hour. No one asked questions, and each window closed afterwards. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he stood up. He glanced at Shursui as he said, Are you sure? Shui was back in his chair and shook his head as he said, "And let you miss all the fun? Fine, but you're gonna have some work to do yourself. Since all of the kids seem to be in on it, I want you to verify how we didn't catch on for over a month." Shui let out a sigh as he said, "But I was just getting to the good part." Ezekiel shook his head and walked towards the door. He was the first to arrive in the meeting room and quietly waited for everyone to show up. Mostly it was everyone who looked after the kids, so Jarvis, Steve, Peggy, Hank, Bill, Tao, Mikhail, Sarah, Alexei, Melina, Bucky, and Fury. Once everyone arrived, Ezekiel didn't say anything and just typed on his computer, pulling up the security footage. As the footage started, Ezekiel said, "This happened earlier today." Everyone watched as the kids started to leave with the help of Ava. Bill was the first to speak as he asked, "Are they still gone?" Ezekiel nodded as Fury glanced at Tao and he asked, "I thought she didn't have a personal sling ring?" Tao shook her head and frowned as she said, "She doesn't, but we have a few that are locked up in the base. She must have used her ability to take one." Bill glanced over to Ezekiel as he asked, "Where did they go? The island? And why didn't you let us know sooner?" Fury nodded in agreement before he turned to glare at Ezekiel as he said, "Even though it's just some of the kids, this is a security issue that will need to be fixed. One that we shouldn't have had in the first place." Ezekiel glanced at Fury before he turned to look at Bill as he said, "I didn't know because I never thought to monitor the kids. As for where they went, it's a theme park." After he finished, Ezekiel pulled up the photos that alerted him to the missing kids. It was a couple of pictures of the main group of kids with the focus on Cecily. From just a glance, you would never be able to tell that she was different from any normal girl, unless you stared at her for a little bit. Everyone was silent before Alexei laughed and then said, "My daughters do good work. You can hardly notice Cecily is different." The door opened as Shui walked in and Melina nodded in agreement as Fury asked, "So who are we sending to bring them back?" Shui took a seat at the table as he said, "No one. They will be coming back in half an hour. At least that's in line with when they went last few times." Everyone turned to look at Shui, before a few like Fury turned to glare at Ezekiel, who dropped his head on the table. Shui smirked as he said, "Oh, looks like you didn't tell them about the other times it happened." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he lifted his head up and said, "I hadn't gotten to it yet." Ezekiel started to type on his computer and pulled up different footage of groups of kids leaving the base over the past month. As he did, Fury looked around at everyone as he asked, "How the hell did this happen and no one noticed at all?" Shui smiled as he said, "Easy. All of the kids left in the base covered for the others. I just went around and checked. They would point me to one place. I would go there, and someone would say they left a little while ago and weren't sure where they went. It works as a pretty good cover if you don't use the base's intercom system or check the cameras." Steve nodded as he said, "Happened to me a couple of times over the past month when I went to chat with some of the kids. I didn't think about it much at the time, since it wasn't important, but looking back on it now it makes sense." Peggy glanced at everyone before she asked, "All right, so what are we going to do now that we know?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "No clue, besides make sure they can't sneak out again." Steve shook his head as he said, "They will need to be disciplined for their actions. I think extra cleaning duty and more PT since they seem to have so much energy." Melina nodded in agreement as she said, "I'm proud of the kids for pulling this off, but we need to make sure they know we are displeased with their actions." Ezekiel was typing away on his computer as he said, "I am already fixing the issue with the cameras and monitoring system. I should have it finished in an hour or two, but I think we have an issue." Fury glanced at Ezekiel as he asked, "What is it now?" Well, this was the second time they went out, and it's only the first group of kids. The other two groups still haven't gone to this new park. Everyone turned to look at Ezekiel as he shrugged and he said, "If we are going to punish them, we might as well let the other kids go out to the park. Then it's even for everyone. All of them get to go out twice, and they get the same punishment." Fury frowned as he said, "So we let this go on for another couple weeks?" "No. We'll confront all of the kids today. Then tomorrow we let the next two groups go with a few chaperones for the same amount of time. After that we start their punishment duties." Tao nodded as she said, "I don't find an issue with that. I can send Wong and Kaiselius to help shuttle them over and watch the kids while they're gone." Mikhail smiled as he said, "I would like to go also. I've never been to a theme park before. Alexei nodded as he said, I wouldn't mind going with the whole family. Steve glanced at Peggy as he said, I wouldn't mind going out either. Fury had started to frown as more people chimed in before he finally said, You know we are supposed to be hidden, right? Fury pointed at Steve as he said, You are considered dead. Same goes for you, Mikhail. Fury then pointed at Alexei as he said, You are an escaped convict. Fury then pointed to the photo of Cecily as he said, It just takes one photo getting out and the right people seeing it to ask questions we don't need. The room went quiet for a while before Tao said, I could ask Agatha to make a transformation potion. It changes how a person looks for a day. Tastes terrible, but it will work so everyone can go out. Ezekiel smiled as he asked, So we are in agreement then? We let the rest of the kids go out tomorrow with some chaperones? Everyone nodded in agreement, even Fury. Afterwards, they decided to collect all of the kids in the base now and have Tao meet Ava and the other kids in the portal room. As the room cleared out, Ezekiel looked over to Fury as he said, You took this a lot better than I thought you would. Fury had a smile that wasn't a smile as he said, Oh, I am pissed. The fact that you left such a big oversight in the base's security is unforgivable. Till I am satisfied, you and I will be doing a full audit of every base's security measures and going over everything to find any other potential weaknesses you might have forgotten. Ezekiel dropped his head onto the desk, causing a loud thud. Fury shook his head slightly as he said, As for the kids, I'm impressed. They pulled off something that even trained agents would have a hard time doing. Ezekiel looked up as Fury let out a small chuckle and said, I guess kids will always be kids. Very well trained and dangerous kids, but still kids nonetheless. 00084. Another 6-month time skip. After a week of training with Tao and Agatha, Theo changed up his routine. He would make all of his clones at night instead of the morning. Most would still go do projects at both bases, but a handful would stay back and study magic or work on a coding project. There would also be a single lucky clone that would sleep in Theo's bed till he switched with it. Theo spent most of his time training his body and chakra control techniques. Mostly he just used the rock wall he had made, since it was the best way to practice both, and he was too small to properly use any of the weight equipment yet. Speaking of the wall, he enjoyed it so much that he made another one in the gym area of the main base so other people could use it. It was massive compared to his personal wall and took up one entire side of the gym's walls, making it well over a football field in length. The height was even increased to more than double the original at close to 900 feet tall, but they had the room since that part of the base was over half a mile underground. The same pool of water was built below it, and Tao even added the same spells. It took about a month for his clones to finish everything, and everyone questioned why it was even needed in the first place. But once the younger kids were able to try it out, it quickly became one of the most popular things in the gym. Even the adults started to enjoy it, which made Theo come up with a cool way to track progress on the wall. His clones set up a bunch of cameras and sensors which would track whoever was climbing the wall. That info would be fed into a computer program he made that would show anyone interested that person's climb in real time or the recording of it. It would also give stats, how long, how high, number of moves made, difficulty of the section being climbed along with a bunch of other information. It pretty much made the climbing wall into an unofficial sport for the whole base. With only 2 people having climbed up to the top, Steve and Alexei. Bucky, Mikhail and Logan were the next highest and have only made it about 3/4 to the top. Everyone else was less than halfway up. Logan did make it to the top once using his claws, but then Theo's clone chewed him out for ruining the wall and having to fix it, which made a new rule that you could only use your hands and feet to climb the wall. Besides the climbing wall, Theo's clones finished all the work that was planned for the base after 6 months. Even the massive running track that turned out to be a little over 5 miles long was finished. It started in the gym room and was about 100 feet wide and 20 feet tall. It snaked around the entire underground base once and ended in the gym room where it began. In that same 6-month period, Xavier and Magneto were finally brought into the proper fold of the operation. Fury still wasn't that happy with it, but he was the only outlier when it was voted on, mostly because he still didn't trust Magneto much, or even Xavier. But then again, Fury didn't trust most people, so Theo and the others weren't really worried about it. Magneto was still the face of the organization that the world knew about, but he now knew who he was really working with. Speaking of which, It was nice to see the faces of Xavier and Magneto when they met the captain. Ezekiel took a picture of them both and has it hung up on the wall in his personal work area. Since they were both brought in, things have streamlined a bit more, and a few of their team has even been allowed to come to the main base. Mostly it was Storm, Raven, Beast, and Sabretooth. Sabretooth was only allowed into the base after he met with Inoichi though, which helped to calm him down a little bit, and also made him not want to fight Logan or Laura anytime they met each other. Another thing of note to happen at the base was one of the reformed widows trying to court Coulson. Theo wasn't sure how it started, but she liked Coulson and made it very clear to him that she liked him. For the past 3 months, whenever he was in the base and she wasn't busy with her duties, she would find him and follow him around till he had to leave. She would even sit in at meetings next to him or would watch him when he was practicing the mystic arts. At first, Coulson tried to be diplomatic about the whole thing, saying he appreciated the gesture but didn't have time for any type of relationship. When she made it clear she was already happy with the weird little thing already going on, Coulson just gave up and let it happen. He even embraced it a little by making sure they would always share a meal together whenever he was in the base, much to the exasperation of Fury. The last thing of importance to happen in the main base was Ava and her progress in the mystic arts. Tao and the other masters who were acting as teachers took Ava and Coulson to the hidden island to practice making portals, which both of them were now able to do, while Fury and the other students still needed some more practice to reach that stage. Coulson was now in the base a lot more often and also acted as a shuttle for Fury until he could portal himself around. Ava's theme park adventures happened within a few weeks of her perfecting the portal skill. Ava and the kids' little adventure outside of the base made Ezekiel and Fury go over all of the security systems in place, and they ended up changing a lot of minor issues. They also added a few new security features and had a small monitoring team always on duty. It was a fun 2 weeks for Theo's unlucky clone, but the base was a lot more secure and the kids had a little less freedom now. Speaking of the kids, all of them were given extra duty around the base for 2 months, and Ava wasn't allowed to learn any new magic for 3 months. She could still practice and focus on what was helping to keep her stable, but that was it. Ezekiel did press the importance of coming to him or someone else if the kids had any issues. He also reinforced that no matter what the request or issue was, Ezekiel would consider it fully. Even if the request was something silly, like someone wanted a pony. The incident also made him look into how much it would cost to rent out a theme park for the day for the kids around the base and the kids from Xavier's school. It turned out you couldn't really do that, but Theo was going to figure out something, so the kids could go have some fun besides the hidden island they used. Maybe he could just build a theme park on the hidden island, but then he would need to find people to run it. Maybe his clones could? The more he thought about it, the more issues he found in his plans. Meanwhile, the social media platform Theo created was slowly getting more popular. He had already created the perfect operating system for smartphones. He just needed someone to create an affordable smartphone, and he was sure they would blow up in popularity. He had some plans to look into contacting someone soon to start the process. He was going to ask Hank about it, but the man was still tirelessly working to find his wife. Hank and his team were still in the process of building the quantum tunnel and wouldn't be finished for over a year or more, since almost every part needed to be custom-made from scratch. As for the platforms, the video service was the most popular platform currently and was increasing the fastest. It also had 2 new stars that were becoming popular. One of them was a random kid from the Xavier Institute who recorded and uploaded the aftermath of Kurt's first video. It was pretty much Kitty chasing after Kurt with a sword for about 10 minutes, but it blew up because of Kurt's popularity and how funny it was to watch. The kid was still uploading new videos, but most of them were just random funny things that happened at the school. Apparently people loved to watch metahumans who couldn't fully control their own powers, since half the time something funny happened while they used them. He would even do short interviews with anyone he filmed, so people could learn more about them. The other rising star was also from the school, but it was an all-girl band led by Dazzler. She was the singer and used her powers to do amazing light shows. The other girls in the band also had similar powers to enhance their performance. One of them was Jubilee, who would shoot out random fireworks as she ripped on lead guitar. The drummer, who went by Fog, had a power to pretty much produce and control fog. She would cover the area above and below the band in fog, which would help enhance Dazzler's lights and Jubilee's fireworks. The last member was the bassist named Aurora, who had a power to produce something similar to the aurora borealis. With all of them combined performing it made a spectacular show which was causing them to become popular. The only thing holding them back was they were currently a cover band and had no original songs yet. But that wasn't a bad thing, since people who enjoyed their videos could vote on the next song they would perform and record. As for Theo's home life, the only thing important that happened besides some birthdays in which Peter and he turned 5, while Millie turned 4, it was Jonathan Pangborn and Sarah were married at his family's shop one weekend. The whole affair was semi-private with only Theo's extended family and the immediate family of John and Sarah, along with a handful of friends. It was a pretty fun experience overall for Theo since he had never been to a wedding before. Jacob BBQ'd for the entire wedding party, which was a little over 50 people. It was part of his wedding gift for both of them, including a month of paid vacation for their honeymoon. Ben's gift was paying for the rest of the party, the cake, and a pair of plane tickets to Europe. They were planning to travel around the place for their month-long honeymoon. The wedding itself was pretty fast overall and wasn't too fancy compared to a normal one. While everyone was slightly dressed up, it wasn't formal with tuxedos and dresses. John wore black colored dress, slacks, and a nice-looking blue collared shirt. Sarah wore a pretty teal-colored dress that stopped at her knees and highlighted her now blue-colored hair. After they finished their vows, it just turned into a pretty normal party except for the wedding cake. Speaking of the wedding cake, when Millie saw it, her eyes lit up and she told her mom in all seriousness, "Mom, I need to get married." 00085. Planning a coup. Sunday, August 1st, 1999. Theo's clone Ezekiel was seated in the main base's meeting room with a handful of people currently on their council. Ezekiel called a meeting to figure out a plan for taking over the island nation of Genosha. Magneto, Xavier, Fury, Peggy, Tao, Agatha, and Steve were seated at the table next to him. Ezekiel pulled up some images which he displayed on the wall in front of everyone as he said, "This is Genosha, a small island off the coast of Africa. I promised Magneto that he could have this country, and we are going to help him turn it into a safe haven for mutants." Peggy glanced at Fury for a moment before she looked back at Ezekiel and said, "You can't just promise someone a country, and why wasn't this brought up to the whole council earlier?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Because it was a personal promise from me. I did tell Fury about it, and he agreed with me that an island was reasonable." Everyone turned to look towards Fury, who shook his head as he said, "I only agreed with him because I didn't want Magneto to have Mars." Everyone glanced back at Ezekiel, who shrugged as Peggy said, "You can't just offer people stuff you don't own, and you can't just take over a country. Why not? Your homeland used to do it all the time." Peggy frowned as she said, "That was a long time ago and things were different then. Plus, with the UN around, they will try to stop you as soon as you make a move." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "That's why we will take over the country in a single day. That'd be impossible with the resources we currently have. Plus, what about the people who currently live there? They won't agree to someone else taking over." Ezekiel typed on his computer for a few moments before some videos popped up on the wall. It showed people dressed in prison uniforms with collars around their necks. These people worked as slaves for some well-dressed people. As the video played, Ezekiel said, "This is video from the real Genosha. What they don't show to the handful of foreign dignitaries that visit each year. Before you go thinking they might be criminals, and that is how they reform people. It's not. Anyone not born into the handful of ruling families are treated as slaves. Any newborns are stripped from the parents and sent to education camps. The videos changed to prison-like schools where kids were chained up and taught how to behave and act." Steve was the first to speak as he asked, "How soon can we attack?" Ezekiel typed on his computer again, pulling up a few things. He then looked at the group as he said, "Some UN officials will be visiting in a few weeks. I want to plan the attack right after they leave." Xavier's brow furrowed as he asked, "Even counting people with powers, trying to take over a country with our group might be a little hard." Ezekiel looked back at the screen as some new information popped up and showed a highly detailed map of the whole island. Certain things were highlighted as he said, "We only need to worry about these key areas. It's where most of the manpower is stationed." Another building came up with giant towers and dishes pointed out from it. Ezekiel motioned to it as he said, "That is the first goal and the priority target. It's the command center for the collars, and from what I can tell is how they keep everyone in line. If someone acts out or is disobedient, the collar will either harm them or outright kill them. Fury studied the info before as he said, "It looks like we have to deal with over 10,000 soldiers and the ruling class. Even then, that might be a little hard with our current resources." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Even with our powered members, it will be hard to accomplish without help." Luckily, Tao and Agatha agreed to help for a small price. Ezekiel pulled up the map of the island and highlighted a new area as he looked at Magneto and said, "Apparently this area is steeped in magical energy. They want to find out why and then build a sanctum for teaching mystic arts on top of it." Magneto glanced at Xavier for a few moments as they shared a mental conversation. Before he looked at Tao as he said, "We see no reason to deny your request. But we would also like to request if it's possible to train a few of our people in the mystic arts. Just the ability to make portals is extremely useful." Tao nodded as she said, "I don't see a reason we can't. But keep in mind, we only take students who are truly interested in the mystic arts." Xavier and Magneto both nodded in understanding before Ezekiel said, "All right, with that out of the way, we need to do scouting of the island." Ezekiel glanced at Steve as he said, "Steve, I want you to get together with Kaiselius. Make at least 4 teams and scout all of the buildings I marked from the mirror dimension. They are running a closed network, so you'll also need to use my USB drives on any computers or servers you find." Ezekiel then glanced around the room as he asked, "Anyone have anything else that you want to add?" When he didn't receive a reply, Ezekiel said, "All right, we'll meet back up tomorrow after the scouting is finished and plan the invasion." As everyone left the room, Ezekiel turned his attention back to his computer. He had been planning the aftermath of them taking over a country and had been gathering supplies for the past few months. He had already ordered enough material to build a few thousand houses. Now he was working on supplies to feed people for a few months. While they could use the resources from the island, he just wanted to be prepared for any issues that might come up. The following day, the group gathered to go over the scouting data and information collected from their target's computer systems. The information they gathered was distressing and made everyone want to push forward with the invasion right away. The things those people were doing to everyone else was monstrous, and even Ezekiel wanted to push the attack deadline ahead. The biggest issue for the push was what they found hidden on the island. Underneath the island was a secret facility that was doing human and metahuman experimentation. They were part of the Weapon X program and worked with the leaders of the country to use most of the population for their experiments. Mostly they were focused on some type of mind control and conditioning program. But they also had a small cloning project set up for trying to make another X-23, which seemed to be working as they had 4 living clones. But only the youngest of the clones seemed to be somewhat healthy. The other 3 were in bad shape from protecting the youngest girl. Just another reason the group wanted to push forward with the invasion plans. But the fact that this new facility wasn't on any records they found at the first facility they raided, or the fact that the reanimated Stryker, Rice, and Sutter never knew about this place, was concerning. Ezekiel scanned over all the data he received and couldn't find any information on who was funding the place or who was really in charge. There were a few people leading the different projects and one man in charge of all the soldiers. But Ezekiel couldn't find a single person who was above everyone else at the facility itself. The only info he found was this place was slightly older than the first facility they raided. Ezekiel let out a sigh and focused on something he could do. As Fury and the others were discussing the best plan of attack and who should be grouped together, Ezekiel worked on changing the UN officials' trip to the island and having it rescheduled to a later date. It wasn't that hard, and within 10 minutes it was done. He then focused on removing all satellite coverage above the area, besides the ones he controlled. Within a few hours, they had a complete plan of attack ready, including a bunch of contingency plans. They scheduled the attack to commence in 2 days after they finished all of their preparations. The meeting soon finished up, and before anyone stood up or the room cleared out, Fury pulled out a folder and set it on the table as he said, "I found Clint. I want to bring him into our group." Ezekiel reached over and picked up the folder to go over it. When he finished, he slid it back to Fury as he said, "Isn't it too soon?" Fury shook his head as he said, "I want to bring him in before S.H.I.E.L.D. finds out about him." The others in the group were curious, and Steve was the first to ask, "Who's Clint?" Ezekiel typed on his computer to pull up some videos of a young man with a bow. He was in a circus tent performing in front of a large crowd, and he fired 5 arrows quickly, all hitting almost dead center of the target. Another video played which showed him shooting arrows at a woman as she was strapped to a target. She was slowly spinning, and he was shooting 2 or 3 arrows at a time. Then some more info pulled up on the screen which showed he was currently 20 years old. Fury frowned a little as he asked, "You already found him?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "About a year ago. I was planning to invite him sooner or later, but I figured I would let him enjoy his marriage a bit first." Peggy was still reading the info on the screen as she asked, "He's only good at archery. Why do you want to recruit him?" Ezekiel glanced over to Peggy as he said, "He tends to be an important hero most of the time, even if he is just a normal human." Fury nodded as he said, "Which is why I want to bring him in now. He could be a big help in taking down Hydra." Ezekiel glanced around the room as he asked, "I know it's not the full group, but does anyone have any objections?" When no one disagreed, Ezekiel turned to look at Fury as he said, "You need to recruit him yourself, but I have a feeling he might turn you down if you don't find a way to bring his wife." 00086, Hawkeye's first time. Saturday, August 7th, 1999. Clint didn't want to admit it, but he was nervous. Only a few days ago he worked in a traveling circus with his wife, until some bald pirate showed up offering him a job. The pirate didn't really describe the job at first. He just said, "You'll use the skills you've trained your whole life perfecting to make the world a better place." Clint would be lying if he said he wasn't interested, even though he didn't know anything else about the potential job. Since he was a kid, he always dreamed what it would be like to be a hero like Captain America. It was just a silly kid's dream, but it was always there in the back of his mind. It was one of the main reasons he pushed himself to be so good with archery. So after thinking it over some, he talked it over with his wife. Laura, the wonderful woman she was, supported him completely. She told him to take the offer and see what happens. It was only a few days later, and now he was geared up and was about to take part in an invasion of some country he had never heard of before. It sounded bad, but he was fighting for the good guys. How did he know that? Captain Freaking America was part of the organization he joined. That was probably the biggest surprise that happened so far. Magic being real was a close second. Clint glanced around at the other people with him. Everyone was dressed up in all black tactical gear, along with black balaclavas and masks that covered their faces completely. The masks were a little weird, being white and red and shaped like different animals. His own mask was modeled after a hawk. The mask somehow didn't restrict the person's vision and even seemed to improve it. When he asked how, he was told the masks were inscribed with magic to make it work, and that they could also stop a bullet. That was one thing he didn't plan to test, though. Clint glanced at the only person dressed differently than everyone else. It was a large man named Mikhail who was part of the assault squad. Mikhail only wore some camo pants. No shoes, socks, mask, or even a weapon for that matter. Clint had no idea what the man was going to do when they attacked and was too intimidated to ask. He cleared his mind. It wasn't his job to worry about it. He was with the first wave that was meant to be stealthy and take out as many targets as possible before anyone noticed. Someone patted his shoulder, and he turned to look at Captain America, who smiled at him as he asked, "How are you feeling?" Clint let out a slight chuckle before he said, "Nervous, but also excited, sir." The man smiled and said, "Just call me Steve or Cap. No need to be formal around me." "All right, Cap." Steve gave him another pat on the shoulder as he asked, "I didn't look into your background. Is this your first time doing something like this?" Clint nodded in reply before Cap asked, "Have you ever killed someone before?" "No." Steve studied the man for a few moments before he said, "The best advice I can give you is try not to overcomplicate it. Focus on the mission, your skills, and working with your team. Everything else can wait. Afterwards, once in a safe area, that's when you can think over the actions you took during the mission." Clint nodded slowly as Steve gave him a smile before he said, "You can also check in with one of our resident therapists after the mission if you need to. Remember, no one will ever look down on you for asking for help, so don't be afraid to ask for it when you need it. We're only human after all." "Thanks." Steve patted him on the shoulder and said, "You're welcome. Now double-check your gear and then go join the rest of your team." As Cap walked over to the rest of the stealth group, Clint pulled off his quiver to go over his arrows one more time. Once finished, he checked his bow over and did one more sight test before he stood up to walk over to his team. He looked over his group, which was the smallest one with only 20 people in it. He was a little concerned that he hasn't had a chance to train with any of these people yet or meet them properly, but the team leader said it would be fine. Clint's only job was to go on Overwatch and call out targets for the team. Clint frowned as he thought, easy, no pressure at all. The team leader, who had spiky silver hair and wore a wolf mask, spoke up as he said, "All right, everyone, collect your gear and let's move to the portal room." As his team started to move out, the leader stayed back with another person in a crow mask. When Clint walked past them, they joined him as the leader said, "Hawk, this is Crow. He'll be your shadow for this mission. He'll watch your back while you watch over ours." Clint gave a slight nod to the man as he said, "Nice to meet you." Crow nodded in reply as he said, "I look forward to working with you." They finished the walk to the portal room in silence, where they met one of the wizards that worked for the organization. Clint shook his head. It was sorcerer, not wizard. He was corrected the first time he called one of them a wizard. Something about them not wearing hats and to be respectful. Clint watched as the man in question nodded to the group and waved his hands before the world started to shatter like glass around them. Afterwards, the man waved his hand in a circle, and a portal appeared which Clint's team moved through. On the other side of the portal, they appeared just inside a fortified compound. It was the middle of the night, and within moments all of his team had disappeared from Clint's sight. Clint looked around for just a moment, and then took off at a sprint towards the Northwest Watch Tower, which had the best view of the place. Once he arrived at the top of the guard tower, he saw Crow was in position next to the guards in the tower. He held a knife in his right hand as he stood slightly behind and between the two men, so that he wouldn't be seen when he appeared. Clint took up a position outside the tower with a good view, but he could still see Crow from the corner of his eye. It only took about a minute before a voice was heard in every team member's ears as the team leader said, "This is Wolf. We will be pulled out in 10, 9, 8, 1. The world started to shatter as Clint and his team re-entered the real world. Before it finished, Crow didn't hesitate as he stabbed his knife into one man's carotid artery. Instead of pulling the knife out, he pushed it forward through the front of the man's throat. The man's eyes went wide as he reached for his neck. As the man let out a wet squelch from his opened-up throat, Crow had already pivoted and thrust his knife into the other man's right temple, straight into his brain. Crow released the knife, and Clint watched as Crow disappeared from the tower as both men dropped to the floor dead or dying. It took Clint a few moments to realize he hadn't moved yet. He quickly took a glance around as he nocked an arrow and saw that his team had already taken care of part of the roaming patrols while he was stunned. Clint then zeroed his bow in on one of the patrols as he scanned the area. He pulled back on his bow as he said, "Patrol on the west side near the gate, targeting right side." He let his arrow fly as he pulled out another one and nocked it. The arrow struck true and took the man through the eye socket as Wolf appeared behind the other man, slitting the man's throat before he disappeared just as quickly. Clint already had his next target sighted and bow drawn back as both men dropped to the ground. He called out as he let his next arrow fly, 3 men under Southwest Guard Tower, targeting center. Clint wasn't sure how much time passed before Wolf said over comms, "Alpha base is clear. We need a resupply and then a portal to Bravo." Clint glanced over his shoulder at his quiver to check how many arrows he had left. After he finished his quick count, he headed down the tower to the other members of his team. A portal appeared soon afterwards as one of the sorcerers floated a case through it. As everyone started to restock their gear, Clint asked, "I know we were quick, but how come the alarm didn't go off?" Crow glanced at Clint as he said, "Ezekiel took over their computer systems when we scouted the place. The alarms are disconnected and the camera system is playing a loop." Clint nodded in understanding before he asked, "Then why do we have the second team? Shouldn't we be able to clear everything like this?" "The second team is to help us with Hotel Base, which is where the bulk of the soldiers are stationed," Wolf said as he handed Clint a new quiver of arrows. The next couple hours passed in a blur for Clint as they swept through the next few bases, clearing them out. Afterwards, they met up with the other team and prepared to attack the last base. As they finished with another resupply, Wolf walked over to Clint before he asked, "How are you feeling?" "A little fatigued, but good." Wolf nodded as he said, You can stick this one out if you want. Our team might not do much this time with the other team joining us. We'll mostly be working as support for them." Clint shook his head as he said, "I'll be fine. I've been in a supporting role all night anyway." "Then we'll be counting on you again. Keep up the good work." Wolf gave him a quick thumbs up as he turned around to check on the other team members. His team ended up waiting for about 10 minutes before they were pulled into the mirror dimension and portaled into Hotel Base. Clint's team disappeared from sight as they spread out to different target areas under the tower that Clint was going to use. As Clint finished getting into position in one of the tallest watchtowers, a new voice came over the comms as a man said, "Slight change of plans. Someone wants to dance?" Clint heard a few people complain over the comms about someone named Madara, before the same man said, "Settle down. He is test running the new shadow clone technique Tobarama, Orochimaru, and Minato completed. Just be ready to clean up the stragglers when he's finished." Clint looked over to Crow as he asked, "What are they talking about?" "You'll find out sooner or later. Let's just enjoy the show for now." Crow walked outside of the tower and stood next to Clint as a few massive explosions went off on the far side of the base, which caused the whole place to wake up. Within half a minute, men started to swarm out of the buildings ready to fight, and within a minute, commanders were taking charge of the men and trying to figure out what was going on. The people in Clint's tower also walked outside to see what was going on and stood next to Clint in the real world. It didn't take long before music started to blast through the whole base from their intercom system, and a man in red armor appeared walking from where the explosions occurred. Clint couldn't tell for sure, but the man looked like he had glowing red eyes. Clint watched as the soldiers took notice of the man and raised their weapons towards him, yelling something he couldn't hear over the music. Clint glanced at Crow as he asked, "Is that guy trying to get killed?" Crow chuckled as he said over the music, "Don't blink or you'll miss it. My sister looks cute in her braces and boots. A handful of grease in her hair." A glissando was heard from a piano, and the music kicked up a little more and the man disappeared from view. A second later, some of the troops who were lined up went flying into the air as the man appeared in the middle of their group, wielding a giant fan and sickle connected together by a chain. Some people tried to shoot him as he began to tear through them like they were made of paper. People, body parts, and a rain of blood was the only thing that could be made out from wherever the man went. "Oh, don't give us none of your aggravation. We had it with your discipline." As the man moved from the first group of soldiers to the next, the only thing left in his wake was a trail of dead bodies. Clint couldn't keep up with the man's movements at all and just followed the trail of carnage he left. Then Clint noticed one of the commanders pull out a grenade and throw it where the man was moving. The man slowed down just enough to bury his sickle into a man's head, catch the grenade, and throw it back at the commander. "Oh, Saturday night's all right for fighting. Get a little action in." As Clint watched, he let out a sigh before he asked, "Who the fuck is this guy, and why are we even here if he can do that?" Crow let out a laugh as he asked, "Would you believe that this is only about 10% of his true power?" Clint shook his head as he said, "I hope you're joking." The man jumped back from a rocket that was shot at him. He placed the fan on his back as he weaved a few one-handed signs which made a large wall of earth rise up from the ground in front of him. Some more rockets slammed into the wall as the man placed the sickle on his back, and he weaved even more hand signs. "Get about as oiled as a diesel train. Gonna set this dance alight." He brought his hands to his mouth as the wall of earth collapsed, and he breathed a jet of flame from his mouth that covered all of the remaining troops in fire. When he finished, he disappeared from view, and a few seconds later, one of the watchtowers exploded as maniacal laughter could be heard from that direction over the music. "You're joking, right?" 00087. Island Cleanup. As Madara was busy with his dance party, a small team entered the hidden facility under the base. Ezekiel used the security system and called most of the soldiers from the facility to help deal with the threat attacking the base, which left it currently manned with a skeleton crew. The team was Steve, Bucky, Logan, and Kaiselius. Ezekiel was back at their base, acting as Overwatch for the whole mission and controlling the enemy's computer systems. As they walked through the hallways of the facility, Ezekiel would point them towards each target. Time passed quickly, and it didn't take long for them to clear out most of the remaining soldiers. The only issue they ran into was when they arrived in the X-23 cloning section. The base commander realized something was wrong with the security systems. he decided to use the clones as a delaying tactic. Him and a handful of people were hunkered down in that part of the base as they waited for reinforcements. They had injected the clones with something and then tossed them into the hallway outside before they barricaded the door shut. Whatever they gave the clones caused all of them to collapse on the ground except for the youngest. The youngest clone was hunched over the others as she shook each of them, calling each one by their name. But none of them seemed to be responding to the girl at all. As Steve moved closer with his group, the girl looked up with tears running down her face. It took her a moment before she jumped in front of the other girls and a single metal claw slid out of her hands as she choked out in a pain-filled voice, "If you try to hurt my sisters, I'll kill you." Logan's claws popped out on instinct, but he didn't move as Steve put his hands up and said, "We aren't going to hurt you or your sisters. We actually came here to help you." The girl lowered her arms the tiniest bit as she asked, "Why should I trust you? You might be like everyone else." Steve smiled gently as he said, "How about we start small? Let us help your sisters." The girl stiffened and cast a quick glance behind her before she said, "I'm not stupid. You just want to take them hostage." Logan stepped forward, his claws already retracted as he said, "Then you can have me as your hostage while my friends check over your sisters." The girl quickly glanced at her sisters once again before she nodded once and moved slightly forward. Logan slowly moved forward, and once he was halfway to the girl, she said, "Lock your fingers together and place your hands behind your head. Then get on your knees by the wall." After Logan finished, the girl moved quickly and stood behind him, one claw on his throat, the other over his temple. She looked at the other men and said, "You try anything funny and he dies. Then I'll kill you." Steve nodded as Bucky and Kaisalias slowly walked with him towards the three girls on the floor. Steve crouched down as he started to examine them. The girl watched him like a hawk the entire time. Steve shook his head as he said, "They're alive, but I have no idea what's wrong with them." Ezekiel's voice came through the intercom speakers above them as he said, "I've already informed Tsunade. She will join you shortly." The girl jerked slightly and cut into Logan's neck a tiny bit as Ezekiel spoke. Before she narrowed her eyes and her voice took on a hard edge as she asked, "You work for them?" As the girl looked at Steve, she slowly pressed her claw into Logan's neck. An instant later, another person appeared next to Steve, already bent over one of her sisters. The girl pressed her claw deeper into Logan's neck out of reflex. Logan held back from defending himself as he gritted his teeth and quietly waited. Ezekiel's voice spoke out over the speaker again as he said, "Words don't mean much, but we're not part of this facility. I've just taken over their systems. Now, if you would kindly remove your claw from Logan's neck, I am sure it would make us all feel better." The girl kept her eyes on the new person who arrived and slowly removed her claw from Logan's neck before Ezekiel said, "Thank you. Now my friend is going to check on your sisters, so don't be alarmed when you see some green mist come out of her hand." After he finished, the woman placed a hand above one of her sisters as a green mist came out of her plan. The woman slowly moved her hand above the girl for about half a minute before she checked the other two girls. She glanced up at the girl holding Logan hostage as she said, "Something is killing them. Did anything happen to them recently?" The girl tensed up, then glared at the door that was barred shut behind the group. Her eyes started to tear up again as she looked back at Tsunade and said, "They gave us something before they pushed us out the door. After a minute, my sisters collapsed. I'll need to move your sisters someplace if I have any hope of treating them." The girl frowned, tears still falling down her face as she said, "Fix them here." Tsunade shook her head as she said, "I can't. We don't have the proper equipment and I'll need help." Ezekiel's voice cut on over the speakers again as he said, "How about we let you keep Logan as a hostage while we try to help your sisters? You can even join them, but you'll have to stand back and let my friends work. Does that sound acceptable to you?" The girl nodded her head after a few moments, so Kaisalias spun his arm to make a portal. As the portal opened, the girl's eyes widened some before a few people stepped out of the portal. They quickly lifted up each of the girls and took them through the portal to set them on hospital gurneys. As they finished, Tsunade stepped through the portal to join them, and once on the other side, she said, "Hurry up, we don't want to waste any time." The girl slowly let Logan stand and was able to keep her claw on his neck as they moved. Once they went through the portal, Kaisalias collapsed it and Ezekiel said in their earpieces, "I know what they used on the girls, but you'll still need to collect a sample of it if we want to help them. So try not to destroy the place." Within the next 10 minutes, Steve and his team were able to clear out the last group of resistance in the facility. Once finished, Ezekiel pointed them to the serum they injected into the girls. It was supposed to make them go berserk, but instead it was attacking their bodies. The youngest girl wasn't having an issue because she was the only one that inherited a healing factor. As for why she didn't go berserk, Ezekiel had no idea. As Tsunade and the others worked on a way to help the girls, everyone else was focused on cleaning up the rest of the island. After a few more hours, the only people alive on the island were the slaves and Ezekiel's team mates that worked on the rescue operation. Ezekiel himself was currently busy as he worked on disarming the slave collars. They didn't make it easy for him either. Every single collar was unique and had to be disabled manually. But that wasn't even the hard part. Once they had someone free of the collar, they still needed to deprogram them and let a Yamanaka help with their mind therapy. The last issue and the worst was the success rate. So far, out of about 200 people processed, only 5 still had their minds intact. The brainwashing techniques that were used pretty much destroyed a person's mind and turned them into a mindless drone. So far, the 5 people they were able to cure were younger and had just been through the brainwashing process not long ago, which made Ezekiel change his focus and was targeting younger slaves specifically for now. The next 2 months passed by quickly as everyone from Ezekiel's group worked on saving as many people as possible, which also made a few things change about how the island was going to be used. While the country was originally meant for metahumans to have a place to call their own, a place where they could live in peace without fear, to be able to walk around normally and not hide who or what they are, Magneto decided that once they went public and declared they were a new nation, he would allow anyone immigration into the country. Metahumans were to be given priority, compared to normal humans though, and Ezekiel agreed to use his resources to do background checks and psychological evaluations on each person who applied. Its immigration policy would be a lot more strict than any other country in the world, well besides Wakanda, who didn't allow people in. But Magneto wanted to make sure that people who moved there had good intentions and wouldn't discriminate against people with visible powers, or to be more accurate, people with deformities. Ezekiel was seated in the main meeting room with most of the council members going over plans for the new country. His team had finally released all of the slaves 2 weeks ago, and they were discussing what to do with the people who didn't make it. Steve's voice was raised slightly as he said, "There has to be something we can do for them. We can't just kill all those people." Xavier shook his head as he said, "Ezekiel and I have both tried everything we can. They have nothing in their minds to bring them back. We even brought in Tao and Agatha to help, but nothing worked." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Plus, we don't have the ability to take care of them in their current state. Then let's figure out a way to take care of them." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, we won't waste any more resources on this. We've spent the last 3 weeks on this, and we double-checked all of them. They are in worse shape than a comatose patient." Steve frowned and was about to speak again when Peggy reached over to hold his hand. Steve glanced towards her and she shook her head as she said, "I know how you feel, Steve, but Ezekiel and the others are right. They've done everything they can for those people, but they aren't coming back. But it's almost 100,000 people. Can't we try something?" Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, "My clones and part of our personnel are being run ragged, and we still can't even take care of all of them properly. I haven't even started working on the infrastructure or housing yet, because we have so many bodies to watch over right now. I agree with Ezekiel. We need to euthanize them and move on. It's morbid and I don't like it, but it will let their souls move on and rest." Tao said as she glanced around at the other council members. "Let's just vote on it. All in favor?" Fury raised his hand as he finished speaking. The vote passed with only Steve and Jarvis voting against it. Once that was finished, they moved on to other issues that needed to be addressed on the island. Mainly food, housing, city planning, and a bunch of other boring issues. It took a few hours, but they had a solid plan in place once they were finished, and they finally came to the last issue. Ezekiel typed on his computer and pulled up the last issue on their list they needed to discuss for the day. The 4 clones they rescued from the facility. While they figured out what the girls were given and were able to neutralize it, the girls were still dying, and everything they've done is just prolonging their life, not fixing the underlying issue. As everyone looked over the information Ezekiel pulled up for them, Hank asked, "Couldn't we transfer them into a new clone body?" That is what you are trying to do with your clones, correct? Ezekiel nodded as he said, yeah, but it's still in the testing phase, and none of them have been stable yet. Plus, we would need to make a clone specifically for each girl, and they are already a clone of a clone. Ezekiel pulled up some more info before he said, the fact they made 4 semi-viable clones out of hundreds of attempts just proves how hard it will be to make them a new body, and we don't have the time to wait. They will be dead within a week. Agatha glanced at Tao before she said, this might be in bad taste, but what if we took 3 of the people who were going to euthanize and use their bodies for the girls? Everyone glanced at Steve for a moment, but when he didn't respond to what Agatha just said, Tao nodded her head as she said, it might work, but I will need to see them first and test a few things though. Let's end the meeting here then, if no one has anything else to add? Ezekiel said as he looked around the room. 00088. When does a person die? Gabby was seated in her sister's hospital room as she watched her sisters in their comatose sleep. Her only real companion was the sounds from the medical equipment, letting her know they were still alive. The last couple of months had been crazy for her and her sisters. Well, mostly for her. His sisters were still asleep and wouldn't wake up. They still weren't fully healed, and the people who rescued them said they were trying their best. But to her, their best just wasn't good enough. Her sisters were still dying. The corners of her eyes started to mist up as she thought about finally being free with her sisters, but not being able to enjoy it. The thing they all dreamed about was now here, and yet she wanted to blame the people who had come to rescue them, but she knew she couldn't. It wasn't their fault. Sure, their attack on the base forced them to become injected with that weird serum. But the serum wasn't the issue. It just showed the underlying issue faster. Her sisters' bodies were already breaking down from being cloned. The only reason she wasn't like them was because she was blessed with a working healing factor. She shook her head to clear it and think about the positives. They were free while also getting to meet the woman and man who were pretty much their parents from a genetics perspective. And they met the person they were cloned from, Laura. Laura was nice and even said she considered them all to be her little sisters. It was nice to have a new older sister. Hopefully her other sisters woke up to meet Laura and the others properly. It would be nice if they woke up soon. Gabby wouldn't admit it, but she was so lonely without her sisters. Laura came to visit a lot, but it wasn't the same. Her sisters were with her since she could remember. Gabby was sad when they weren't around. Gabby looked up to the door as she heard someone knock before it opened up and a few people walked inside the room. She knew one of them. It was the man who didn't smell. The other 2 were new. Both of them were women who smelled a little weird. The man smiled as he said, Gabby, I want you to meet some friends of mine. This is Tao and Agatha. Gabby nodded to the women in greeting before she looked back at Ezekiel and asked, did you figure out how to save them? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, no, but we have an idea. We just need to test something first. Ezekiel turned to Tao as he said, you can start whenever you like. Tao moved over to one of the girls and began to chant slowly as she moved her arms in a pattern above the girl's body. After about a minute, an orangish-golden spell formula appeared above the girl, and Gabby let out a small gasp as she watched. This was magic, like the portal thing she saw before. Were they going to use healing magic to help her sisters? She thought, getting a little excited. The formula slowly spread out and covered the girl from head to toe before it shot out golden wisps. The wisps connected to different points all over the girl's body before they started to expand in size. After she finished with the first girl, she moved to the next and then finished with the last girl. A spell formula floated above each girl and pulsed slightly for about 10 minutes. Then the spell formulas slowly faded from view as Tao let out a sigh. She frowned as she glanced over to Ezekiel and said, it won't work. Their souls are too weak. Gabby glanced between Tao and Ezekiel for a moment before she asked, is there a way to make them stronger? Yes, but it requires time. The best way would be for them to age normally. Tao shook her head. Agatha nodded as she said, we could try to speed up the process, but trying that on souls that are already weak, it could completely destroy them. Gabby's eyes started to mist up again as she looked at her sisters. Why did life hate them so much? Because they were clones? Because they weren't born normally? Were they not meant to be happy like everyone else? Tears started to run down her face as she thought about a life without her sisters. The sisters who did everything they could to protect her from the shitty life they were born into. Ezekiel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as he said, "We still have a few more things we can try. Don't give up hope." She numbly nodded her head, tears still streaking down her face as she watched her sisters quietly. Ezekiel turned to the others and motioned them out of the room, before he softly shut the door. Ezekiel let out a sigh as they walked down the hallway before he said, "I have no idea what I'm going to do." Tao placed a comforting hand on his shoulder as she said, "Sometimes there is nothing you can do." Ezekiel glanced over at Tao as he said, "That doesn't make me feel any better about it." It wasn't meant to. A week passed and nothing changed for the sisters. The handful of things they attempted didn't work. Even the experimental longevity drug failed to work. It was dangerous, but it was the very last thing they could do for the girls. When even that failed to improve the girls' situation, Gabby resigned herself to watch over her sisters till the end. VVVVV. It was midnight and Theo was currently climbing his rock wall as some of his clones were reading in his personal training room. His thoughts were a mess as he thought over what else he could do for Gabby and her sisters. He had pulled out every obscure piece of knowledge about the Marvel Universe to help him, but he had still failed to help the dying girls. Luck just wasn't on their side. He thought of possibly putting them into some kind of stasis chamber, but Tao said it would just weaken their souls more. If their soul was complete and had no issues, it wouldn't be a problem. But a weak soul will only get weaker since the soul itself can't be put into stasis and the body itself won't be able to help the soul heal while it's in stasis. Theo really did try everything he could think of to save the girls. He even begged Tao to use the time stone on them, but after her examination of the girls, she said that even with the time stone, it wouldn't help. Their souls were too fragile and it could rip them apart. Unless, of course, we had the soul stone to help stabilize them, but then we wouldn't need to use the time stone at that point. While Theo was lost in thought, his chakra control lapsed, and his next hand hold didn't contact properly. As he released his other hand, he immediately slipped off the wall and fell into the water pit below. As he pulled himself up out of the water, Shursui commented from the reading area nearby as he said, "You should just accept that you can't save them." Theo let out a sigh as he walked over and sat down next to Shursui and his other clones. After about a minute, Theo said, "I know, it's just hard. Gabby should be this super positive kid that's always optimistic about everything. At least that's how she was in the comics after her sisters died. But the Gabby I've met is barely holding it together." Theo shook his head and said, "Inoichi has tried to help the girl, but he said if her sisters die, he doesn't know if he'll be able to help her get over that trauma. It might break her will to live." Theo leaned forward and rested his head on the palms of his hands as he said, "If only there was a way I could give them a full and happy life together." "You still can, or at least a fake one." Theo glanced over at Shursui, who smiled and pointed at another clone. Theo followed his finger and tried to figure out why he was pointing to Itachi. As Theo tried to figure out what Shursui meant, Shursui said, "Itachi gave Izumi a full and happy life." "Son of a language, young man," Agatha said as she interrupted Theo. Theo glanced over to Agatha, who was smiling at him, and he said, "You know, I'm actually pretty old, right? You will always be considered a child compared to me." Agatha winked as she finished and turned back to the book she was reading. Theo glanced back at Itachi for a few moments before he said, "It could work, but would we be able to group all the sisters together in one Tsukuyomi? Why not? That's what Madara wanted to do." "Good point," Theo said, before he shook his head and said, "Thanks. I was so concerned about not being able to cure them. I forgot I could still do something for them. That's what you pay me for." Shursui flashed a cheeky grin when he finished. Theo shook his head as one of his other clones nearby asked, "You pay Shursui?" "I don't pay him anything." The clone looked over at Theo as he said, "But he just said you did." Theo reached up to rub the bridge of his nose with his fingers as he said, "I still have no idea how some of my clones get like this." Tobarama, who was seated close by, spoke up as he said, "It's some flaw I missed from the shadow clone jutsu when I made it. When you make more than 10, the rest tend to have a weird personality quirk. Then again, I never thought people would be able to make more than a handful at a time in the first place." Tobarama pointed at the clone of Theo who thought Shursui was paid as he said, "That one seems more gullible than normal." VVVVV. Gabby watched as Ezekiel and some other people were working on her sisters. Ezekiel had come by the day before and told her he figured something out. Something that would give her sisters a full life. As Ezekiel and the others finished, one by one her sisters started to wake up. She instantly bolted from her chair to greet them as her oldest sister Zelda said, "You're a mess." Gabby cracked a weak smile as she said, "You aren't much better yourself." Another sister, Bologna, scoffed before she said, "At least we aren't crying like a little kid." Gabby tried to wipe her face as she said, "I wasn't crying. Something was in my eyes." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I believe the proper response is, 'Oh look, it's raining.'" All the girls turned to glare at him. He just gave a friendly wave before he said, "I'll leave you girls alone." VVVVV. Ezekiel, Tao, Itachi, Inoichi, and Agatha watched the girls who were all laid out on beds. The 4 beds were placed in an X so that all of their heads were next to each other. In the middle of the X was a weird-looking pyramid. The pyramid was made of vibranium and had a bunch of runic symbols etched into its surface. It also contained a few rare gems and other precious metals laid out on its surface, almost like a circuit board. It glowed with an otherworldly light as it pulsed where orangish spell lines connected to it. Those spell lines connected to each of the girls' heads, into a complicated spell matrix floating above them all. Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he asked, "You think it will stay stable?" Tao nodded as she said, "With the vibranium as the core focus, it should have no issues." Inoichi agreed as he said, "When Itachi cast his Tsukuyami on the girls, it was stable. I also made a mental block for Gabby. She won't be affected when she dies." Ezekiel let out a sigh of relief before he asked, "How long do they have before it ends?" "It will end sometime tomorrow night." Inoichi frowned as he asked, "Don't you think you should have told Gabby the truth?" "I wanted to, but I felt it might dampen her mood going in. I will deal with the consequences when she comes out of it." Tao smiled as she put a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder as she said, "I am sure she will appreciate the gesture when she comes out." Ezekiel just nodded his head as he watched the girls dream of what their life should have been like together. VVVVV. Gabby slowly opened her eyes, which were fuzzy from sleeping. As she blinked to clear her eyes, she tried to remember what just happened. Her memory was being a little hazy. Gabby shot up in bed. She had just died. She paused. This wasn't her home. She glanced around the room for a few moments, trying to figure out where she was. Then her eyes landed on her sisters that were still young. Her eyes widened as she remembered. They were trying something to cure them. But it worked. They were cured. They lived a whole life together. Was she reliving her life just before she died? She remembered hearing that could happen, but this didn't feel like a dream to her. She glanced down at her hands, her young-looking hands. She clenched her fists and her blades popped out, one out of each fist. As she looked at them, a creeping feeling overtook her, and she somehow knew this wasn't a dream. This was real. As she retracted her claws, she stood up out of bed and glanced around the room. She saw Ezekiel seated in the corner of the room. He had looked up at her when she made noise getting out of bed. As he stood up, he motioned her to come towards him. Her feet dragged on the ground as she shuffled closer to him as she tried to figure out what was going on. She clearly remembered living a full and happy life with her sisters. So many happy memories flashed through her mind, all of them with her sisters. But she also knew that she was now here and that this was real. Everything in the room felt and smelled real. This had to be real. But the life she just lived was also real. It had to be. She felt all of it. You couldn't fake that. Her eyes started to mist up as every fiber of her being screamed at her that it couldn't have been fake. That this was fake and her memories were what was real. Ezekiel waited as she made her way over to him, lost in her own thoughts. When she finally stopped in front of him, he gave her a sad smile as he said, "I'm sorry. I couldn't save your sisters." Gabby's mind raced as she thought over his words and the implication behind them. She took a deep, shaking breath, tears threatening to spill out as she asked in a trembling voice, Then that wasn't real? What do you think?" Gabby looked down at her shaking hands, which she was clenching unconsciously. She glanced back at her sisters for a moment, before she looked at Ezekiel again as she said, "Everything felt so real." Her voice cracked with hope as she asked, "It had to be real, right?" Ezekiel placed a comforting hand on Gabby's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. That slight touch helped to calm the girl's shaking body as he said, "It was the only thing I could do to give you and your sisters a full life." Gabby's body started to shake again as Ezekiel said, "All of your minds were connected together. Everything you shared with them. Everything they shared with you. It all happened in your collective minds. If that isn't real, I don't know what is." Gabby teared up, her voice wavering in her throat as she looked down at her feet. It took a few moments before she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "They're dead, aren't they?" Ezekiel lifted his hand from her shoulder as he softly asked, "When do you think a person truly dies? Is it when they're shot in the heart?" Gabby choked back a sob and nodded her head as hot tears streamed down her cheeks. "Maybe when they drink some kind of deadly poison, or have an incurable illness." Gabby couldn't help herself, as a sob ripped through her shaking body as she nodded again. Not really understanding what Ezekiel was trying to say, Ezekiel placed his hand under her chin and raised her head so he could look her in the eyes as he said, "You're wrong. A person only truly dies when they're forgotten." Gabby's breath hitched in her throat as she matched Ezekiel's unwavering gaze. His other hand tapped her on the head and then her heart as he said, "As long as you keep them in your thoughts and in your heart, they will never truly be gone." Gabby let out an anguished sob that wrecked her whole body as Ezekiel pulled her into a tight hug. Minutes passed as Gabby cried into Ezekiel's chest, her whole body shaking as she let out her feelings. She wasn't sure how long they stayed like that, but eventually her body gave out and she started to collapse from fatigue. The last thing she thought before she drifted into unconsciousness was, this was the first time she could actually smell Ezekiel. 00089. All that work for nothing. A few weeks after he settled everything with Gabby, Theo settled down to focus on training and learning from his new mystic art masters. During his studies, he came up with an idea on how to prepare himself for psychic threats. He double-checked his current defenses and then asked his teachers to check them over for him. Theo appeared in his training room and summoned a set of clones for the day. Afterwards, he moved towards Tao. She was seated next to Agatha drinking tea as they discussed creative approaches to use different spells. Tao smiled at Theo as he approached and asked, "Good evening. Are you ready to begin your lessons for the day? I was actually wondering if the both of you would help me with something instead." Both women turned their full attention towards Theo as he said, "My first concern when I was brought to this world was protecting my mind." Theo looked a little nervous as he said, "I think I did a decent job, but I need to find out for sure. Since I know how truly powerful some of the psychic powers are, and I want to see if I can defend myself from them." Tao nodded in understanding as she said, "So you want the only two people you fully trust to test your defenses?" "Yes, that's reasonable. I'll gladly help you out, my young apprentice," Agatha said, as she placed her teacup down. Tao smiled as she said, "As will I. When do you want to start?" "Whenever you like. My defenses are already in place and ready." Tao pointed at a chair next to her as she said, "We can start in a few minutes. I just want to prepare in case there is a backlash. After I finish, Agatha will test you next." Theo calmed his mind down while he waited for Tao to start. After a few minutes, a light flashed around Tao. She glanced at Theo as she said, "Prepare yourself. This might not be pleasant." The next second, Theo felt a sharp pain near the front of his head, but it disappeared after a few seconds. He then closed his eyes and focused to look inside his mindscape. Once he could see inside, he searched it over to find Tao. She was standing on the rooftop of a skyscraper overlooking one of the cities he had built. After a moment, he appeared next to her and asked, "So what do you think? Passable for someone who is untrained. Really? What's wrong with it?" Tao raised one finger as she said, "You have no real defense against someone trying to access your mind. It's honestly pretty pathetic how easy it was to access your mind palace. I saw you grimace in pain as I entered, and your nose is currently bleeding. Do you want to know why? Because you're stronger than me?" Tao smirked as she said, "Thanks for stating the obvious. But no, that wasn't the reason why you felt pain from my intrusion. I used a powerful spell to brute force past any defenses. Being the complete amateur you are, you pretty much have none. So the spell attacked your mind palace instead." Theo's face crumpled as he said, "No need to be so harsh." Tao shook her head before she said, "You don't fully understand. If I wanted, I could have broken into your mind and you would have never known about it. She is correct. Your outer defenses are pretty much non-existent. Both of them turned to see Agatha, who smiled at them as she said, I thought it would be more fun to join you. Plus, if you destroyed his mind palace, I wouldn't get a chance to test it. I know my outer defenses are weak. I was planning to make something to counter mind readers. Maybe a helmet like Magneto wears. Plus, I focused all my efforts on internal defenses. Agatha scoffed as she said, Please, that stupid helmet. It only helps against someone like Xavier. A mystic arts user who has mastered mind arts could easily bypass his helmet. You need to learn proper mystical defensive arts. Tao nodded as she held up another finger and said, What you have built in here is impressive to look at, but I can already tell it is way too weak. I doubt it will hold together properly if I put pressure on it. As she talked, two little kids appeared on the rooftop, one next to each woman. Both Tao and Agatha glanced at the children before they looked at Theo, who gave them a smirk as the kids asked, Hi, who are you? After both women answered the question, the follow-up went, What ya doing? Tao glanced down at the kid as she said, Just looking around. Why? Because I felt like it. Why? Because I can. Why? Tao glanced at Agatha and the other child who was also asking her why, then glanced at Theo who had a Cheshire-like smile on his face. The kid spoke a little louder as he asked, Why again? When she didn't answer after a few seconds, Tao glanced at the child before she asked, Is that all you can say? The child tilted his head to the side as he asked, Why? Tao looked at Theo as she said, While something like this can be annoying, it's easy to overcome. Why? Tao waved a hand towards the kid, and he disappeared like he was never there. After a second, two kids appeared, one crying and the other asking why. Tao glanced at Theo before she waved her hand again. Once more the kids disappeared before three more appeared, two of them crying and another asking why. Agatha, for her part, just watched as the process repeated a few more times. Only the first kid standing close to her, as he asked, Why? Repeatedly. Once there were a handful of kids crying around Tao, she finally looked a little annoyed and said, I applaud your creativity. Why? She waved her hand again, and this time all of the kids disappeared, including the one next to Agatha. After a few seconds, nothing happened. Theo frowned and checked his internal defenses to find that his kid defense was completely removed like it never existed. Unfortunately, something like that is easily removable. Tao had a smirk as she looked down at Theo. Theo let out a sigh as he said, Okay, so all my prep work was for nothing. Not really. It was good practice for you. It will make rebuilding your mind palace a lot easier. Now let's see what else you've made here. Tao finished speaking as she turned and walked towards the rooftops door. Agatha and Theo followed behind her quickly. As they entered the stairwell, the door closed behind them automatically. Tao raised a single eyebrow in question as she glanced at Theo. Theo just smiled and gestured for her to walk down the stairs. After they opened the first door, Tao smiled as she said, You made a moving maze. Agatha nodded as she said, And a very complex one, but still too weak to be useful. Tao closed her eyes as she finished. A few moments later, the area around them started to fade away. When Tao opened her eyes, only a single building remained. 1,000 copies of the same building. She glanced at them for a few moments before she looked at Theo and said, While I admit, you put in a lot of effort, but making copies of your inner palace won't help. Tao closed her eyes and the buildings started to disappear until there was only one left. But something unexpected greeted her when she opened her eyes. A few thousand different people were standing around now looking at their group. She cast a glance at Theo before she closed her eyes again. After a few moments, she opened her eyes and frowned. I can't remove any of these defensive measures. A man with chalk-white skin, a third eye, and some horns sticking out of his head moved forward from the group. He gave a disarming smile as he said, It's because we are not part of his defenses. Tao cast a glance over the group and recognized a few of the people standing around. She nodded before she said, Interesting. While they are part of your mind, they are also separate from it. She glanced down at Theo as she said, You can use them to help defend your mind? What happens if they get hurt or killed? Wouldn't they disappear from my mind? Tao shook her head. It might make their physical form disappear, but they would still be here. It would just take a while before they reformed a body. Like I said, they are part of your mind. So unless your mind was completely wiped, they would be here. The man with horns nodded his head as he said, "It's more than that. As long as he has chakra, we will always appear here. Unless he removes our memories from his chakra. At that point, we would completely disappear." Fascinating. You should definitely integrate them into your defenses. Agatha nodded in agreement as she added, "They would act as a great defensive measure. I can barely sense them, and I see them in front of me. Before that, I didn't even know they were in your mind palace. But how would they help?" Tao jabbed Theo in the chest with the tip of a finger, and he frowned as he rubbed where she poked him. "Even though this is your mind, your body here can still be attacked. It's one of the most basic ways to protect your mind." Tao finished with a smile as she looked down at Theo. She then pointed at the group of people around her as she said, "You can think of each one of these people as a defensive or offensive mind weapon, one you won't have to create or control yourself. But that's for later. Let's finish checking out the last of your defenses." Their small group then moved to the last building. Tao quickly moved towards the basement and studied the setup for a while before she said, "Whatever you made in here is weird. I assume it's made with your chakra?" "Yes. Let me handle this one," Agatha said as she closed her eyes. It took a few minutes. But when she opened her eyes, she said, "That was different. For someone less experienced, it might have been an issue. But it would only take them longer to remove it. It wouldn't stop them." Tao nodded as she moved to look at the server racks in the room. As she studied them, she said, "Ingenious. You turned your memories into extremely complex computer code." Tao closed her eyes for a little while. When she opened them, everything was gone and a single thick book was in her hand. She opened it and glanced inside for a few moments, before she closed it and handed it to Theo as she said, "Now we're even." "Even?" Tao smirked as she said, "I just wanted to see what your name was in your past life. Now let's leave your mind palace and start with your training. The memories from my previous life should be blocked by God." Tao patted Theo on the head as she said, "They are, but your thoughts betray you and the block placed on those memories. Whenever you think about your old life, it creates new memories that aren't blocked." Theo sighed before he said, That makes too much sense. I'll have to be careful of that in the future." "Exactly, but for now, it's time to start your training." After they exited Theo's mind palace, Tao placed a powerful and complex spell of protection on his mind. When she finished, she said, "For now, that will protect your mind from anyone trying to access it." Theo wore a grateful smile as he said, "Thank you. I appreciate it." Tao smiled as she said, "It's my responsibility as your master to keep you safe. Now go have your clones collect the books on mind magic. You will need to read everything on it before we start." 00090. Christmas. The night before Christmas, Ezekiel and his clones moved through the base. They worked in teams and carted around tons of wrapped presents for all the people currently living in the base. Over the past few months, Ezekiel had spent his time finding out what everyone liked. Whether it was clothes, movies, games, guns, or anything else, he compiled a massive list, and with the help of his clones, he went about ordering at least 5 gifts for each person in the base. Once he collected everything, he spent a couple days with his clones wrapping each present and tagging them for each person. Then he stored them in his training room till it was time to deliver them all. Ezekiel and his clones finished while the whole base was still pretty much asleep. Besides dropping off presents to everyone's rooms, they even decorated the cafeteria for the event and set up a large Christmas tree. Underneath the tree was a single present for each person in the base and anyone who visited it often. Even Fury had a present. Next to the tree was a banner that read, "Merry Christmas and Happy New Year." VVVVV. 1999, Saturday, December 25th. Theo awoke earlier than normal and started getting ready for the day. It was Christmas and his family had the whole day planned. But first he needed to wake up his sister and his little brother. If he was being honest, he didn't need to do anything. His parents would take care of it. But he loved his family and enjoyed helping them out. So he would always get up early to help wake up his siblings. As Theo was getting ready, he shook his head as he looked at his clothing choices. He had already asked if he could pick out his clothes the next time he grew out of what he currently wore. His parents said they would let him help next time. But they didn't agree to him outright picking his own clothes, unfortunately. As Theo finished dressing in a blue t-shirt with some cartoon-styled cars on it, he headed upstairs to deal with his sister and little brother. While his little brother wouldn't be an issue, Millie didn't like to wake up. Actually, sleeping was number 2 on her list of favorite things, so it made sense. If you have to ask what number 1 is, you didn't know Millie at all. Theo entered the room his siblings shared and went towards the dressers. He removed a set of clothes for his little brother first, then found a set of clothes for Millie to wear. He laid them out next to each of their sleeping areas. Then he moved towards Millie. She was sprawled out on her bed, blanket thrown to the side, her head no longer on her pillow, with one leg hanging off the bed. Theo shook his head as he pushed her leg back into the bed. He then picked up her pillow and placed it on the floor with a few of her larger stuffed animals. He poked her a few times to make sure she was fully asleep before he stepped back. He chanted lightly under his breath and waved one of his hands at his sister. After a few moments, she slowly moved a little. He moved his hand a little more, and she rolled slightly. He put a little more effort into the spell, and she rolled off the bed completely. Theo canceled the spell as Millie fell. Millie dropped a couple feet onto her landing pad and let out a grunt. After about 10 seconds, Millie sat up. After she rubbed the sleep out of her eyes, she glanced around before she focused on Theo and asked, "What happened?" "You fell out of bed." Millie looked down, then up at her bed. She looked back at Theo as she asked, "Why'd I land on my pillow and toys?" "I tossed them down there just in case, while I picked out your clothes." Theo gave his sweetest smile as he finished. Millie glanced down one more time before she said, "You the best, Theo." Theo's sweat dropped before he said, "I know. Now start getting changed while I wake up the little guy." Theo quickly turned to look at his little brother as he finished. His little brother Isaac was still fast asleep. So Theo carefully checked to make sure his diaper was fine. If it wasn't, he would have to go get one of his parents. While he could probably change the diaper himself, he didn't plan to do that at all. That type of stuff was above his pay grade. As Theo checked Isaac, it looked like he was changed sometime in the night. His diaper was still fresh. Theo then carefully dressed his little brother. Like Millie, his little brother slept like a log. So even though he was cautious, he didn't need to be. Once both his siblings were dressed, Theo helped Millie clean up her toys on the ground and make her bed. After they finished, Theo headed downstairs followed by Millie. They would have brought their brother, but he was still sleeping. Plus, Theo could only really hold him properly. It was awkward trying to carry him, let alone carry him down the stairs. Actually, Theo could easily do it, but he had to keep up appearances around his family. Theo spent the next half an hour watching Millie as she played the video game he was working on. It was pretty much done at this point, but he still wanted to play test it more. Plus, he needed to figure out how he was going to release it. Maybe he would just make a website for it. His overall plan was to sell it to himself. Well, the company he was making for his social media platforms. It appeared on paper, but at some point he should make it real. Heck, he even owned property for it in Brooklyn. Maybe once the building was done, he would look into making it a real company. At some point their parents woke up and came downstairs with their younger brother. Daniel stopped by Theo and gave him a kiss on the cheek before she said, "Thanks for getting Millie up and dressing Isaac. You're always such a big help. Your father and I appreciate it a lot, sweetie." Theo smiled up at his mom as he said, "I'm just glad I can help." Jacob spoke up from the kitchen as he said, "Theo, can you get Millie off the computer? We are heading to your aunt's in a few minutes for breakfast." Theo looked up at his mom and hesitantly asked, "Pancakes?" Daniel smiled in response with a slight nod of her head. Theo immediately moved next to Millie as he said, "You heard Dad. We are going to Aunt May's. But I want to finish my new house." Theo hit the exit button to pause the game and looked right at Millie as he said, "Pancakes are more important." "But listen to me, Millie, pancakes." Millie seemed to freeze for a moment as she realized what Theo said before she asked, "We're eating cake for breakfast?" Theo nodded as he said, "Pancakes." Millie instantly saved the game and turned it off. She then jumped out of her chair as she said, "Let's go." Daniel chuckled as she watched her kids before she said, "All right, we'll leave in a few minutes. Go put on your shoes as we wait for your father." Millie raced to the door and hurriedly tossed on her shoes as Theo took his time. By the time he was finished, Jacob came out of the kitchen. In his hand was a steaming cup of coffee. He traded the coffee to Daniel and took Isaac from her. Then the family left the house and went to May's. The whole family was there, including Peter and his parents. As they sat down to eat, Millie asked, "Where's the cake?" Everyone turned to look at Millie as Daniel said, "Theo might have told her we were having pancakes for breakfast." Some people chuckled as May placed a couple of fluffy golden brown pancakes on Millie's plate. Millie studied them for a few moments before she said, "This doesn't look like cake." Theo had a couple placed down on his plate as he said, "Because they are pancakes, not birthday cake." Millie looked over at Theo, like he had just ruined her whole day. Theo gave her a bright smile as he said, "If you don't want your pancakes, I'll eat them." Before he poured warm syrup over his own pancakes, Millie watched as he took his first bite, and his face went euphoric as he chewed. As she watched, her father put some syrup on her own pancakes. Before he poked her cheek as he said, "Just give them a try. They're your brother's favorite food for a reason." Millie stared at Theo a few moments longer before she reluctantly stabbed her own food. She eyed the plain-looking food for a moment longer before she put it in her mouth. A moment later, her eyes lit up and she stared in wonder at her food. It didn't look like any cake she'd ever eaten or seen, and Millie had seen a lot of cakes. One of her favorite things to do at the grocery store was to look at the cakes on display in the bakery. She would check them every time she went shopping with her parents. But the thing in front of her now, this pancake, it was definitely not a cake. It might be light and fluffy like a cake was, but it didn't taste sweet like a normal cake. But that didn't stop it from being delicious when covered in syrup. Millie looked back at Theo. He had already finished over half his food. She was so lost in thought about this new food that she had stopped eating. She glanced back at her food. The plain brown things weren't real cakes, the ones she loved, but they tasted good enough. Millie decided then and there that pancakes were a good substitute when she couldn't have real cake. The rest of breakfast went smoothly as the family talked quietly and just enjoyed each other's company. After breakfast, everyone gathered in the living room to open presents. Millie was the most excited of the kids, while Theo and Peter just waited patiently. Most of the presents were pretty normal. Some clothes, toys, and even a couple of books for Theo. The last presents for the kids were big boxes, all the same size. Peter, Millie, and Theo had to open them at the same time. As Theo pulled off the snowman-styled wrapping paper, he paused. He looked at the box and was confused for a few moments, then looked at Millie and Peter and saw they were given the same thing. Each of them was given a brand new computer. Theo's brain shut off for a few moments. He wasn't really sure why this happened. As he was stunned into silence, his father patted him on the shoulder as he said, "Hope you like it. We know you were talking about making your game playable with multiple people. We figured you would need more than one computer for that to happen. We have the spare bedroom upstairs set up for you already. That way all of you can work and play on the game when I watch you." May finished with a smile. Theo looked at his excited sister and Peter. He then turned to his parents and extended family and said, "Thank you, everyone. This will help out a lot." The next couple hours was spent setting up the 3 computers in the spare bedroom. Peter's dad, Richard, had some experience with setting up networks, so he was able to hook all 3 computers up to a small switch. Once finished, Theo loaded the game code and software up to each computer. The rest of the day was spent hanging out with the whole family. Some light snacks were had for lunch as May and Jacob cooked a massive dinner for everyone. After dinner, they settled down to enjoy each other's company and play some family games, mostly card and board games, consisting of teams with 1 kid and 2 adult partners.